Hi everyone, and welcome to the second part of my 3D to illustration video series. In this video, I'll be showing you my process for texturing the models in Substance Painter, which are later used to render the final illustration. If you haven't seen the first part yet, make sure to check it out. I walk through how I modeled the entire scene in Blender. Alright, let's pick up where we left off. First, I need to unwrap the models. I'm using the Smart UV project method since it's quick and ideal for this kind of project. I'm not preparing these models for games or animation, just for the final illustration. This method does create visible seams, but we'll avoid noticeable artifacts by using triplanar projection in Substance Painter. For the mound, I'm unwrapping only the part that's above the water's surface. For the water, I'll unwrap just the portion visible from the camera. This way, I can maximize the use of my texture space without wasting resolution on unseen areas. After importing the models into Substance Painter, the first step is to bake the mesh maps. To do this, switch to the Bake Mesh Maps tab, set a higher output resolution for better detail, and hit Bake. These baked maps, like curvature, ambient occlusion, and normal, will be used by generators in our procedural smart material setup. To start the texturing process, I'm assigning my procedural base material to all the objects in the scene. If you'd like to try it out yourself, you can download this material for free from my Gumroad page. The link is in the description. For the water material, I'll turn off all other layers and keep only the base color active. Since I need control over the material's opacity, I'll first switch the shader in the shader settings to PBR with alpha blending. Once that's set, I can adjust the opacity value directly to get the transparency I need. Next, I'll start adjusting the base colors of each material, just to get a clearer sense of how the overall scene is shaping up. Once that's in place, I'll begin detailing, starting with the stone material. I'll slightly exaggerate the edge damage layer to make the highlights more pronounced. Then, I'll shift the dirt layer toward a greener tone to simulate moss growth. For added texture, I'm using a custom grunge map in the dirt generator, but feel free to experiment here depending on your project. If you're having trouble visualizing your dirt mask while working, switch the viewport mode to mask view. And once you're done, just switch it back to material view. Next, I'll duplicate the dirt layer and give it a lighter, more saturated color. I'll also change its blending mode to normal and swap out the mask generator from dirt to dripping rust. This generator helps create a more streaky effect, giving the impression of growing foliage or weathered buildup on the stone surface. To make the mask appear more granular, I'll turn off the blur slope filter in the mask layer stack. I'll duplicate the layer once more and remove any generators from its mask stack. Instead, I'll add a fill layer and assign a leaky looking texture to it. This layer helps introduce more variation in the moss, creating subtle dripping streaks that enhance the sense of organic foliage growth. I'll set the projection mode to planar, then use the viewport widgets to adjust the texture's rotation and position. By tweaking the contrast and brightness, I can fine-tune exactly where and how prominently the moss appears. As a final touch, I'll add a paint layer to the mask stack. Using a black brush, I'll erase areas where the moss feels unnecessary. And in a second paint layer, I'll use a white brush to paint in moss exactly where I want it. By the way, if you'd like to try this setup yourself, all the project files from this video series are available on my Gumroad page, completely free. I also regularly upload other projects and asset packs there, so feel free to check them out. And if you find them useful, consider subscribing so you don't miss future uploads. For the ground mesh, I'll be using similar techniques as before, with just a few small adjustments. I won't go too deep into this part since it's not much different from how I handled the stone material. Instead, let's move on to something more interesting. Texturing the water surface. For the water material, we'll use ambient occlusion as the main driver for our masks. I'll start by adding a new layer above the base, give it a slimy green tone, and add just a bit of height, enough to suggest vegetation buildup. Next, I'll apply a black mask and use an inverted AO generator. This way, the vegetation appears mostly around other objects, where it would naturally collect. I'll tweak the balance and contrast to refine the mask, then add a warp filter to distort the shape slightly, giving it that organic, water-warped feel of live and decaying plant matter. To control the shape of the vegetation buildup more precisely, I'll add a paint layer below the warp filter and mask out areas where I don't want the effect to appear. Next, I'll duplicate the layer and change its color to add more variation to the vegetation buildup. This gives the water surface a richer, more layered look. I'll adjust the mask setting slightly to differentiate it from the first layer. And just like before, I'll use a paint layer to manually refine the details and remove areas where I don't want this effect to appear. Now that both layers are in place, I'll go back and fine-tune their colors and reduce the opacity. This helps soften the effect and prevents the vegetation from looking too plastic or artificial. Next, I'll add some vegetation debris to the water surface, using Gaussian spots as the main texture driver. I'll create two layers using similar mask generators, but give them different colors and adjust parameters like size, balance, and contrast to introduce variety. Once the debris layers are done, I'll duplicate one of them and swap the Gaussian spots texture with the stains and spots texture. This will form the base for our lily pads. I'll fine-tune the mask using the balance and contrast sliders to get a cleaner result. Then, I'll add a paint layer to erase any unwanted areas from the mask. By adding another paint layer, this time using a white brush, I can paint back in detailed lily pads using the underlying texture as a guide. To avoid any height conflicts from previous layers, blending over the lily pads, simply switch the active channel in the layer stack to height and set its blending mode to normal. For a final touch, I'll add one more layer on top, set its blending mode to multiply, and use a Voronoi texture as the mask. To achieve a painted, brush-daubed effect on the water surface, I'll apply a blur slope filter to soften the edges and break up the pattern. And that wraps up the texturing stage of the process. In the third and final part of this series, we'll dive into rendering the scene and post-processing the final image in Photoshop. I hope you're enjoying this short how-to series so far. And if you are, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support truly helps. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.